Welcome to this brief instructional video on frailty measurement. My name is Karen Bandeen-Roche. You can see my credentials on the slide, and I also am the co-director of the Johns Hopkins Older Americans Independence Center. This module is one of a series being promoted by Frailty Science and again sponsored by the Information Dissemination Corps of the Claude D. Pepper Older Americans Independence Center here at Johns Hopkins. Please visit our website, frailtyscience.org, for more information. Here are the learning objectives that I hope you'll come away with from this presentation. First, that you'll be able to identify and distinguish commonly used frailty assessment instruments. Secondly, you'll be able to explain how to choose between instruments. And finally, to describe frailty assessment validation and the role that it has in instrument choice. Frailty of older adults has been long recognizable. I imagine if I were to ask you to imagine a frail older person, you could do it. 400 years ago, Shakespeare wrote a lovely characterization in As You Like It. You can see describing the sixth age as one that shifts into the lean and slippered pantaloon, spectacles on nose, pouch on side, the man's youthful hose, well saved, becoming a world too wide for his shrunk shrank. It's exactly one of the hallmarks of frailty that we recognize today. But it really took until around 30 years ago for the measurement of frailty to begin to become standardized. You see at the top of the slide two very early publications, which respectively assessed frailty as sort of a disability manifestation or as adverse events. And since then, there have been just a plethora of publications on the measurement of frailty. A 2016 literature review led by Brian Buda involving other colleagues identified 67 distinct published frailty instruments, and that has only grown since then. Of those 67, 9 were highly cited, defined as 200 or more citations, and you can see them listed there. Also frequently used and has really ascended since 2016 is the Edmonton Frail Scale. We don't have time to go through all of these, but I do want to lead you through 3 that have been recognized, I think, really as the pillar paradigms around which many of the others have been developed. The first is the Deficit Accumulation Index, also termed as the Frailty Index. By this concept, frailty is recognized as an accumulation of health problems. Those problems are what are termed as deficits, and further conceptualized as deficits that by themselves don't strongly confer health risks, but in the aggregate, if many of them are experienced, something larger. And indeed, in the original paper, the index was seen as reflective of the rate of one's aging. Incidentally, our series includes a module on concepts where you can learn more about the concept underlying this measure. And so indeed, to implement the measure, one assesses many deficits. The index is perfectly allowed to vary in content, which deficits, which items one assesses, as well as the overall number of items. Generally, between 30 and 70 items are assessed. And the important thing is that they should represent multiple domains of health. That's crucial to the validity of the instrument. And these may represent laboratory findings, physical function limitations, diseases, symptoms, sensory, cognitive deficits, even family history. Then the score, the actual measure of frailty, is just taken as a proportion. The number of deficits that a person has divided by the total number of deficits assessed. This score, this proportion of deficits experienced, can perfectly well be then just utilized as a score itself, a roughly continuous measure. And that's often taken as a benefit of this measure. But cutoffs do exist. So for example, one publication defined less than 0.08 as being non-frail, greater than a quarter of the deficits experienced as frail, and in between as pre-frail. A second paradigm, which has arisen really more recently, is the pre-disability paradigm, um, described nicely by Cesare and colleagues, and really part of the conceptual framework of the SPRINT study. This posits frailty as a precursor to overt disability in older persons, really pre-disability. It's operationalized using the short physical performance battery, or the SPPB, and very specifically an SPPB score of between 3 and 9 among persons with no frank mobility disability is taken as being frail, where no frank disability is defined as incapacity to complete a 400-meter walk test within 15 minutes. So again, really a precursor to disability. And then finally, the physical frailty phenotype is the paradigm and commensurately the measure that has arisen here at Johns Hopkins. It was originally described in a landmark paper by Linda Fried and colleagues, and you see a quote from that paper. Physical frailty as a biologic syndrome, that is a critical mass represented by a critical mass of signs and symptoms, which indicates decreased reserve and resistance to stressors, resulting from cumulative declines across multiple physiologic systems. That is a statement of etiology. And finally, causing vulnerability to adverse outcomes, pretty much what any frailty measure is meant to indicate. A few other publications were seminal in describing this paradigm. Buchner and Wagner recognized the geriatric syndrome part, sort of the hallmark signs of frailty, and then the other two papers were the first to begin characterizing frailty as a dysregulation of multiple physiological systems. All of that concept finally resulted in what you see before you as the measure of physical frailty. So there's no need to look at the detail on the right part of the slide. You can pause the presentation and look at that in detail if you'd like. That's from the Women's Health and Aging Studies. But the 5 criteria, the 5 symptoms or signs manifesting supposedly as a syndrome for the physical frailty phenotype are listed at the left. And so you can see weight loss, exhaustion, low energy expenditure, being slow, or manifesting weakness. 5 criteria. If a person has none of those criteria, they're labeled as robust, between 1 and 2 pre-frail, and between 3 and 5 frail. So we've laid out that there are a bunch of frailty assessment methods. There are 3 that have become sort of pillar paradigms. So how does a practitioner or a researcher choose between them? Why is it even important to choose between them? Well, if you see at the top bullet, it is important because subgroups deemed as frail by different methods often have minimal overlap. Really, these methods identify quite different people sometimes. And so thinking carefully about which method to use is important. 2 considerations. First, how does one intend to use the measure? Do you intend to roughly screen a clinical population? Do you intend to use it as an outcome in a research study? And so on. One important consideration that at least was foreseen and discussed to some extent in the Buda et al. 2016 paper. Second consideration is exactly what does one intend to measure? An accumulation of deficits representing biological aging, a pre-disability state, a state of physiological dysregulation manifesting in a critical vulnerability. Decide what one wants to measure, and then critically to evidence that one's assessment method actually does measure that thing intended. And that process is called construct validation. And so let's briefly cover validation and illustrate it in the context of the physical frailty phenotype. So in validation, one begins with what's called a construct. that is a postulated attribute of a person that can be well theorized, well described, but can't be measured directly, only can be measured using indirect measures. And so you can see the idea of a construct in an oval exists, we can theoretically describe it, can't directly measure it, and so we need to indirectly measure it with multiple surrogate measures. Frailty in older adults likely is such a measure. And so now we begin with frailty as our construct. We want to validate a certain measurement of frailty. What is validity? Well, establishing validity is to establish that a measurement strategy accurately and precisely assesses the target, the construct that we want to measure. And so, of course, then, the very first step is to define the construct that we want to measure. So here's an expanded slide on the physical frailty phenotype. What is it that I'm trying to ascertain? So for sure, a health state, we've already said, we've hypothesized that it results from a freestanding physiological mechanism. The next bullet gets more specific. What do we mean by that physiology? Well, a physiology in which energetics, muscle health, and nutrition is all disrupted. A state that signifies a loss of resilience in homeostatic regulation, so really in the ability to achieve stress response. Also states what it's not. It's not just a secondary manifestation of chronic diseases. It's not just chronological age or disability or cognitive dysfunction. Bortz was the individual who first hypothesized that it's intervenable. And then, of course, it's a state that induces vulnerability to a host of adverse outcomes, and really likely upon experiencing a stressor. Okay, so that's our definition. Once we have a definition, then we obtain measures that we think may do a good job of indirectly assessing the construct. And finally, to validate them, we assess various characteristics. And so on the left, you see 4 classical types of validity listed and what each indicates. So face validity just means that the result of the measure looks like it should. And this generally, literally is an eyeball assessment. Content validity means that the measures I've chosen, these things in the boxes, in the green font, that they span the defining aspects of the construct, and they also exclude the extraneous ones. And so that has to do with expert assessment to choose the right measures. And sometimes, if there's a very large number of possibilities, random selection among those. Criterion validity means that the measure is associated with other measures that we would expect it should be associated with. We can assess that empirically. And finally, construct validity means that the measures behave as they theoretically are predicted to based on the definition of the construct. And so we can assess this by experiment, or we can assess this by mathematically working out what the distribution of the observed measures should behave like if, in fact, they flow from the construct. And latent variable modeling is one statistical method that can assess that criterion. Let's briefly go through this for the physical frailty phenotype. And so face validity, if you were to look at these 3 women, measure their frailty, if somehow the person in the middle was labeled as non-frail and the ones on the left and the right were labeled as frail, that wouldn't make any sense. That measure would not have face validity. Content validity, at the top of this slide, I've put in some reminders of the theory underlying the physical frailty phenotype, disrupts energetics, muscle, and nutrition. And so the criteria represent problems with energetics, exhaustion, energy expenditure, muscle, weight loss, nutrition. Muscle is slowness, nutrition is weight loss, and then slowness is a integrative measure. Also, what is it not? It's not age, it's not just comorbidity, not just disability, not cognitive dysfunction, and none of those things appear in the definition. That all has to do with content validity. Criterion validity should correlate with a measure that, really it needs to in order to be useful. Well, if we're identifying vulnerable people, the measure needs to identify people at heightened risk for adverse outcomes. And finally, construct validity. Well, by experiment, we might be able to ascertain whether frail individuals have a slowed return to homeostasis following exposure to a stressor. Or by latent variable modeling, we might be able to ascertain whether the distribution of the criteria is consistent with the definition of a medical syndrome. And indeed, you can see a publication there that implemented that finding. And so that's it for our module. Hopefully, you're now able to identify and distinguish commonly used frailty instruments, including the Deficit Accumulation Index, pre-disability paradigm and measure of the SPPB, and the physical frailty phenotype, to explain how to choose between instruments by considering their use and what it is you're trying to measure. And finally, to describe frailty assessment validation, the things we just went over, and its role in instrument choice, providing evidence that the measure does assess what it's meant to measure. And then finally, just to highlight for your view a few high priority knowledge gaps having to do with the measurement of frailty. The first has to do with optimizing measurement for clinical uses. And so there's a ton of studies out there evidencing that certain frailty measures are associated with adverse outcomes. There's many fewer evidencing that frailty measures achieve strong metrics for screening, that is strong predictive accuracy, or for case finding. And so more of those studies are needed. Secondly, there is some evidence of differential measurement, or more recently known as algorithmic bias in frailty measurements, whereby individuals of the same underlying frailty physiology state may report or exhibit frailty criteria such as exhaustion differently. There's evidence, for example, that Black and white older American populations may exhibit at least report on exhaustion differently. And so this is something that needs to be addressed in next generation measures. And then finally, clinical pre-frailty assessment has gotten off to a good start, but a recent paper has come out really identifying many, many gaps, and next generation pre-frailty assessment is a worthy goal. Thank you so much for completing this module. Thanks to the sponsorship from the Johns Hopkins Older American Independence Center, and you can learn more at frailtyscience.org. It's been great to be with you today.